Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Mike Stubbs. I'm the director of Art Bomb and the creative director of Doncaster Creates. And we're going to look at full circle. We've got a range of incredible speakers all gathered together, most of which have been involved in the research process from day one. So it's great to see everyone getting together actually to celebrate this incredible artwork. And then yourselves, there are a number of people here who've got a massive sort of knowledge base in the audience. But it's important that because obviously this project was developed and produced during a pandemic, and we're still kind of coming out of that information really and trying to work out what our new protocols are. And people are still getting used to actually coming back into museums and galleries. So it's really important as well to do an event like this in this new museum and art gallery, which is still kind of finding its feet as people actually realise that it's now open, even though it was due to open a year ago. Now, from my perspective as the curator of the show, that's in a sense it's like basic curating. Like what it's meant is like choosing an artist, and at this point I want to acknowledge Yu-Chen Wang, who's a Taiwanese-born British person who are living in London. I've had the joy to work with in other cities, and in making the selection to work with Yu-Chen on this project, it was also part of my journey in terms of moving to Doncaster 3.5 years ago and learning about the region, learning about the biodiversity, the environment, its local geography, and also, of course, meeting many of you within this process. So it also forms part of my research and part of my journey, and I have to say immediately that in terms of the result of the work, I'm extremely pleased with how it's resulted, and I think it's a fantastic artwork, and I think we should give Yu-Chen a round of applause. I then want to say just a couple of words really on what we mean by artistic research or artist research, and the reason for selecting Yu-Chen. It wasn't just that I thought she was great, but it was also based very much on the previous work I've seen her do, which in a sense is a sort of deep engaged research process which mixes between different disciplines. So Yu-Chen is interested in everything and really gets under the skin of a place and a project and a set of ideas. And we'll learn more in her presentation at the round table later. So in a sense, she was the perfect artist, in a sense, to do a creative inquiry. And that's how I think of this project, even though the result of it, of course, is an aesthetic video installation, which, of course, the public can enjoy and take from it what they will. There's some ambiguity in the work, and from my perspective, it's dead important that artwork asks questions and just doesn't tell people what to think. And then finally, I just want to mention that this project has led to a kind of a kickstart to another project or two, one being Rewilding the System, which is an artist residency scheme, and some of the artists in the room I'm going to acknowledge now, Brigitte and Angela, who's coming, and also David Bramwell at the back, who are going to be undertaking artist residencies, thinking about art, environment, water, people going forward. And then also another project called Symbiosis, which is a partnership with Rotherham, which are going to be artist bursaries in South Yorkshire to think about similar sets of themes. So in a sense, this kickstarts and building on the work that Yu-Chen has already done, and in partnership with many people in the room who've been incredibly generous with their time and information in going forward to develop a sort of regional arts and ecology lab. That's kind of happening, not just through planning strategy, but actually by people really being present and doing it. We've already started, and I think it's significant, and I'm very happy with that. Yeah, so the plan is Liz is going to give a talk, Then there are going to be 5. I have to also apologise that Damien Allen, our chief executive, who's also an environmental scientist himself, can't be here today because he has some personal things to attend to. So then there'll be these 5 short talks. Then we'll do a quick. I've got to just ask that question. Quick 10-minute instant questions to anybody, so we don't lose steam. Then we're going to go for a 10-minute break. Grab more food, coffee, tea, use the loos. Then we come back in and we'll do 30 to 45 minutes of discussion. And it's very much the intention, because of this is actually quite a gathering in terms of who's in this room. That is will be an open framework to people to discuss some of these ideas. And of course, this is being recorded, and it will be of use and utility to other people in the world. So we're all we're all learning. So thank you for coming. Thank you to the people that can't be here. And I think I'm going to hand over to Liz McIver. And I'm not going to say a lot, but Liz is obviously an extremely well-established heritage historian who also branches out into talking about this and is the public face to sort of heritage history and industrial heritage for a lot of people, because she's been on telly and knows lots about the history of the railways, lots about the history of the UK canal system, and a lot more that I'm hoping to learn more about. And has also collaborated with Yu-Chen, Wang in the past, and hopefully into the future. So with no more ado, over to you, Liz.
Oh, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me okay. I know I've got a mic on, so I don't want to shout too loudly and deafen anyone. Thanks very much, Mike, for the introduction. And thank you to Mike and to Yu-Chen for inviting me to come today. And really, it came from my previous experience working with Yu-Chen. She'd asked me to come and respond to the work that she's done here, based in Doncaster, the Full Circle film. And I suppose that's what I'm going to try and do today. But what I want to do is to put it into the context that I understand, how I kind of interpret heritage, and what remains of industrial landscapes and industrial collectivised memory. My job at the moment, I'm a museum curator by background. I'm a social and industrial historian. And I've been doing that, well, since I was a teenager, really. And I've kind of, as much as I've tried to leave behind, the dark satanic mills and kind of railway viaducts, it's never really happened. I've always kind of had those at the heart. I grew up in Manchester, and my working life has mostly been in Yorkshire and in South Wales. And again, it's that connectivity that connects me to places like Doncaster. So there's an affinity there with that kind of identity around a sense of place. And it's what I want to explore now. I work for the Cooperative Heritage Trust. I run that charity. And, the sort of basics of that is that co-ops and cooperative history is deeply embedded, actually, with this sort of interpretation, this story, with these communities. So that's me. And I wanted to start with an image of where I live now. This is very close to my house in Irwell Valley. And as you can see, so I live just behind the Manchester, Bolton and Bury Canal, which is now, it's in water, but it's disused for traffic. And this is Clifton Country Park. This is what it's currently called. But it's the site of the former wet earth colliery. It's one of the really early collieries to use technology, steam power for pumping and that kind of thing. But you wouldn't know it if you arrived on the site today. It'd be very difficult to sort of establish that in your mind. It's a nature reserve, a reservoir. It's got a children's play area, a couple of nice ice cream vans. It's sort of lauded by Salford City Council as being a place to go to unwind, to connect with, nature. And it's a nature reserve, so you expect to see birds and wildlife and the odd rat. But what I think more people need to know about is that it's the site of not only a very early colliery, but a very important one, because it's actually where experimentation with water begins in earnest. James Brindley, who's very famous, of course, in canal history, he does some experimental work there with the colliery owners to try to pump what's a lot of water, it is called wet earth colliery after all, out of the workings. And they're not deep workings. This is the late 1700s. The mine's been going for a long time. It is productive, but it needs more technology to make it competitive. And this is an image from underneath that place of one of the remaining tunnels. There are lots of tunnel networks underneath the park. There's lots of sort of latent gas as well, so they're quite dangerous to go down into. But it gives you a sense of the industrial buried underneath the natural, you know, and the kind of idea of rewilding an area, that it does cover up strata and layers of what's been there in the past. And it's Full Circle really explores that in Doncaster, explores those sort of layerings and how people get to grips with the landscape. This is a very obvious example of artwork interpreting that. Again, it's at Clifton, it's at Wet Earth. You do have to find this, it is in the woods, but it's the sculpture of a pit pony. And this is, I suppose, the opposite of what Yu-Chen's done. You know, this is a very obvious, you know, representation telling you what to think, what to feel, how you should interpret the remaining industrial infrastructure that's in that park. So in this case, the pit pony, before the industrial steam technology was brought in, pit ponies were ginning water out of the mine, very inefficient way of doing it, and very dangerous. And it's at this site, and again, it's not anywhere in the artwork, that an 11-year-old boy called Richard Boardman was killed by being crushed between the pit pony and the coal wagon in 1874. And that was just run-of-the-mill. That was ordinary experience. It wasn't in the local papers. It was just recorded by the coal company as a normal, everyday accident, an 11-year-old boy killed. And I just thought I'd mention that because that's what you don't get. You don't get that human story. You don't get that memory unless you go looking for it. And sometimes it takes artists to do that. Mining and exploitation of the landscape, particularly in places like Doncaster, this leads to innovations. It leads to the connectivity of our industrial history. So mining is linked intrinsically to canals, it's linked to railways, and it's where, you know, those ideas take a really long time to get off the ground, that you have to have innovation and failure before you get success. And it's not a story of kind of starting out with nothing and ending up as a billionaire. That's not what most people experience. So this is an example of one of those early steam locos developed for coal mining. And of course used initially on wagonways or tramways. And I wanted to kind of look a little bit about etymology as part of this, because tramways, and again they appear in Full Circle in the film, what remains at a site, the remaining rails, we call them tramways, and that word has been disputed by historians over time. Samuel Smiles, who was a Victorian writer, attributed them to Benjamin Outram, who was an engineer, and said they were Outramways because he'd used them to move heavy goods. But actually it goes back a lot further than that. It's a Norse word, and it translated roughly means to move something heavy or to do hard work. So tramways, or thromways as they were pronounced, particularly in the Danelaw, you know, kind of we're going back to our really old history. That's what those tramways did. They moved heavy things because people weren't able to lift those sorts of loads, and horses were what were pulling those wagons along. So what does that mean for places where mining and where sort of peat collection and heavy industry was dominant? This is a relatively modern image from 2015, and it's kind of related to a mapping exercise for Doncaster around population centres, where people live, where there's indices of deprivation, and why. And of course, it's obvious looking at that, it's all around collieries, it's all around old industry. And even though the industry isn't there anymore, you know, there might be some sort of industrial archaeology related to it, but the people are still there and the people's descendants are still there. So it makes you ask, what does that mean for how we interpret those landscapes for people now? Because those people aren't going anywhere. And it brings us back to that idea of how we integrate it with nature and how we talk about the future and preservation of green spaces. So the coalfields, you know, of Derbyshire and Yorkshire get turned into these green lands, and they've been referred to as edge lands, places that are very near to population, but that give somebody an opportunity to engage with natural processes, to hear birds, you know, to sort of get away from the grimy centre and the kind of urban population. So that's how we understand them now. But I want to almost go into reverse. This is a version of people being very worried about the urbanisation of what were previously quite green spaces, traditional landscapes. And let's not forget that those landscapes were controlled, were manipulated, were engineered by people for resources and for rents and for agriculture. So they're not truly wild, and they never really have been. Anywhere where there are people, there are interventions and integrations into the landscape. This cartoon is about the fear of the coming railway to places like Doncaster that were relatively rural. And this idea is, oh, horses are going to be obsolete. You know, if the railway comes, you're not going to have horses, you're not going to be able to have land. It's going to be carved up by this terrifying modern technology, which is inherently dangerous because it's new. So that's one artist's interpretation of that. Another is much more sort of domestic and prosaic, much more related to what I do for a living, which is how people interpret it for themselves, how they represent their own stories in objects. And this is a souvenir mug from the Manchester and Liverpool Railway and the Manchester to Sheffield Railway. And it's that idea that people want to celebrate this new thing, and they feel that it's something for people, not just for goods. So you start to see this. You don't see this with canals. There's no sort of canal mugs and canal plates that people make. They're definitely thought of as industrial corridors. This is another one, another example of how artists interpret those changes. And this one is part of a triptych by John Martin. The triptych is called The Judgment. And this particular one is the one I chose, one of the paintings, The Great Day of His Wrath. John Martin was referred to at the time as Mad Martin by some of his contemporaries. And he was really painting his response to an urbanised and industrialised landscape in the 1850s. And to be honest, this painting was very contentious. It was toured around northern cities, and it was attacked by workers with knives because they felt it represented an attack on their livelihood, on their way of making a living, which was, for the first time, based on a wage economy, on something that potentially could offer them opportunity instead of living off the land. So there's different ways of looking at these interventions and integrations. And what it means is that where you have populations around industrial centres, you start to get homogenisation of experience. Railways particularly bring branded goods to people. And this is an example of railway tea, the wrapper from railway tea. But it's where you get Coleman's mustard, and it's where you get, you kind of Robinson's jam, and people having a shared experience through logistics because they're based in urban centres. And from sort of my world, this is an early picture of a cooperative factory. And of course, what is included is the private sidings to move raw product and goods around. And that's only able to happen because of industrial centres that are based on the power, the money, and the influence that's coming out of towns like Doncaster. Doncaster Co-op actually opened in 1868, and it was part of what we call in the co-op movement the second wave of co-ops, because the very early ones start in the northern in textile towns, and then in the 1860s they kick off in mining communities and railway communities. And there's a reason for that, because railway workers in the 1860s were a cut above, the kind of labouring class. They earned more money, they had skilled, respected trades, and they had, in most cases, jobs for life. But they were experiencing in the 1860s wage insecurity for the first time. So this is still a relatively new industry. And people who'd previously been able to afford meat, bacon, beef, things like that, that weren't available to the lowest paid labourers, suddenly found that the cost of living rose and their real earnings and their real standards of living dropped considerably. And that was what caused them to open their own cooperative societies. Doncaster eventually merged with other societies into what is now the cooperative group. So if you see the sort of blue and white logo, that's what I'm talking about. Barnsley, on the other hand, were fiercely independent and didn't want to play. So that's an example of kind of, we're going to hold out, we're not going to join in, and we're certainly not going to join in with Doncaster. That's what we're not going to do. But I thought it was worth mentioning this because The reason that the Doncaster Society forms in the first place is because they're all railway workers, and they all get together in the education rooms of Great Northern to make this society happen, and that there's solidarity within a community. And it's a map here of that kind of distribution. This is food and clothing retail trade. It's not sort of heavy industry, but you can see straight away that where the kind of key logistical hubs, the depots, they're all in railway places. They're all, you know, showing that connectivity of that network. Kind of going back to co-op in a way here, Hexthorpe was a site of cooperative housing that the Doncaster Society set up, and it was also important for railway history and railway communities. It was at the centre of a web of lines approaching Doncaster, and where there were basically railway companies competing with each other to use those lines. And that competition and that lack of communication, that lack of cooperation between railway companies in order to make money led to what may be known locally here, hopefully still, the Hexthorpe disaster of 1887. And it was where a special train, an excursion train, was stopped at the station, and the train, the express train to Hull on the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire line overshot the signal and then realised too late that they were going to hit the stationary train that was at the station. They did hit it, and part of the reason they weren't able to stop was they were using vacuum brakes instead of automatic brakes, which had been developed. It was considered to be a penny-pinching, cost-cutting exercise for the railway company, and Sir Edward Watkin, who was the chairman, also known at the time as the Railway King, a magnate. He's originally from Manchester and he's buried near where I live. So, you know, so we have got some criticism for him. He blamed the driver and the fireman for the disaster rather than the company's cost-cutting exercises. Thankfully, when they were tried for manslaughter at York Assizes, it was overturned and they weren't blamed. But I wanted to mention this incident because we're talking about the kind of ghosts, if you like, of the past with Yu-Chen's work. And that area, Hexthorpe, has traditionally been a place where people have seen or claim to have seen ghosts. Now, the kind of ghost stories related to the railway incident tail off in the 1970s because we're talking about 100 years has passed, so living memory of that incident is now gone. So you don't tend to get people seeing railway carriages and seeing people injured on the ground. And that's because those things don't get talked about in the same way with current generations. So it's an interesting thing to explore, especially when we're looking at artwork. What are the ghosts that remain and how do we sort of commune with those ghosts? In this case, it was 25 people dead and 94 seriously injured. A little bit more of a kind of nostalgic image here of the plant workers coming out in 1901. And they're being filmed by Mitchell and Kenyon, famous filmmakers of the time. And I chose this still from the footage. It's worth watching if you haven't seen it. There's a chap here with a big eye patch on. I really hope he wasn't injured at work. I hope it was the result of a punch-up in the pub. But you never know. But what's quite interesting is that you sort of see this uniform of the working classes coming out. In the footage, there are lots of children who are working at the plant as well, lots of young boys, aged about 11, 12, 13. A lot of them have given the finger to the camera, which I find really interesting because it's not the typical response. It's not what you expect people to do. Think of Victorian people or Edwardian people as very culturally different from us and remote from us, and actually they're not, you know. And it's things like this that remind us of that. But what I think is really interesting is what happens when this shared experience of all these men and women, because there are a lot of female workers in this film as well, when they're leaving this building, they're employed by the railway company. What happens when that shared experience is gone, is no longer there? How do people respond to that? How do they still have a sense of identity and place, especially about where they're from, where they live, where they're bringing up their children? And how do you kind of capture that and how do you engage with that? There's been various attempts in the past to do this through tangible artwork, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning. This is an example of a physical reminder of something associated, a kind of celebration of what a place has been able to achieve for this the speed record of the Gresley engines. And then we go into the less tangible, sort of not as structured story, a more interpretive approach based on things that you can't physically see, based on, you know, communities that are complex and that are transitory and have their own part to play in a place. So that's an example of how that might work. And this is very popular at the moment. This is a very popular type of art form in post-industrial towns. And it's the stories that don't form the traditional narrative. So that's what Yu-Chen's work represents to me, this full circle. It's the idea of how do we associate ourselves in the places where we live and work now with what's gone before, not always harking back to a better time or a more sort of simple time, but how do we kind of use artwork to commune with the ghosts of the past, and how does that inform what we do in the future? How do we sort of continue to capture and celebrate what's special about a place like Doncaster? And what will be the future technology that people rely on and the future shared experience that they make into artwork in 50 years or 100 years' time? I think that's kind of my take on it, really. I don't know if anybody wants to ask any questions about what I've just said, or we're ready for the next person to speak. But I had quite a strong sense of feeling a connection between this place based on those interpretations of a landscape and what it really means to delve into it and to kind of have an emotional connection. Because that's what I do for a living. I kind of make that bridge between something that was there and people who experience it now. Okay, that's it. That's all I have to say for now.
I think we should do questions. Just a few, maybe 2 or 3 questions if anyone has got an immediate question or comment.
I'm really interested in what you said about the cooperative movement too, but I'm also interested in terms of how, I suppose, working class traditions and legends can link to that. And I think, you know, thinking about, for example, I think it was in St. Lawrence in America, there was a famous workers' strike, which was mainly women.
Can you speak up a bit?
Sorry. There's a famous strike in St. Lawrence in America, which was mainly from the women, and it was about bread and roses. You know, we want bread, but we want roses too. And it's the way people look to the landscape outside the city. We did an event a couple of weeks ago in the Open Eye Gallery in Liverpool, and there's a community bakery in Anfield. But we're interested in seed and what seed means, and using seed as a currency and sharing the seed. So it is that, going back to that kind of cooperative idea of what you can do with something you can produce. So they produce pies, and it's invested in the community. We're producing seed, wildflower seed, and it's what you can do in terms of expanding nature in those communities, but really partly to mark the people. So we've done a lot of work in Everton, for example, which lost 120,000 people in the demolitions. And then they knock the tower blocks down, and all that is left is a green space. So it's how you mark that, I think, which is really interesting in terms of what you're touching on.
Incidentally, there is a cafe in Leeds, a cooperative. It's an independent co-op called Bread and Roses for that reason, because they sell bread, but they also have roses at the front door. So it's that kind of thing that when people need to do something, often they come together to do it through shared experience, and through that, realising the need to plant themselves back into community, back into, it could be environment, it could be housing, but actually it's traditionally what we've done when we've been uprooted from traditional communities, and we've had to deal with change. And we've had to deal with change in the last couple of years, haven't we? You know, there's been an enormous change to how people have lived and worked and coped and communicated. And, you know, we were talking about it earlier, that there is that sort of network of experience, that kind of meshing. And in a way, just saying, oh, I'm just interested in mining history, or I'm just interested in railway history, you need the context. You have to have the rest of the experience, otherwise it doesn't make sense. It's just a series of facts. So I completely agree.
I thought you were going to say, Richard, because at one station we talked about the cooling towers up the road. You know, it's Eggborough. Yeah, which the cooling towers are now down, and there was a conversation about whether that should become like a nature park and a celebration of coal-fired power stations as we stop using fossil fuels. But it's also, with some irony now, of course, that we're also, we were talking earlier about water savings in relationship to cleaning clothes and gendered clothing. So things have really kind of slipped round there, and now they're gone. Yeah, they were hardly filmed; they've just gone. And of course, they're a sort of major thing on our local landscape.
And the cooling towers are like a lot of cathedrals. I did go inside them once, and I do remember talking to somebody in Doncaster who actually talked about painting Clarice Cliff designs on the side of one of them. But it's the materials and the substrates too. So I'm really, and carbon capture, because concrete's a great, it produces a lot of carbon when you make it, but it works the other way. And we should be using these kind of materials from each locality, which does make it about the circular economy in a big way.
No, it's not to do with cooling towers at all, but what I thought was really interesting about the etymology of certain words, like Deneby Ings, for example, about the relationship to water, not to industrialised water necessarily, but original sources of water, rivers, streams, kind of marshlands, meadowlands. Ings, obviously, again, is an old word meaning a kind of place by the water, a floodplain. Water meadow, I think, is another way of describing it. And ings are all over Yorkshire, not just in South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, North Yorkshire, everywhere. Because people know intrinsically they want to live near water because it's their way of getting around, it's their way of surviving, but they don't want to be flooded. So they choose places that are close to floodplains but not on floodplains, and then they can exploit the kind of environment, the strata that floodplains create. So water towers, even water cooling systems, we have to interpret that in a way that makes sense to our lived experience. But we all choose that now. We choose places that are close to water. We have fountains in our town centres. We kind of want views of these things because it makes sense of our landscape. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking now because I know that it's somebody else's turn.
Can we get Yu-Chen on, please?
I think whilst we're waiting, I know time is precious, I'd just like to start talking about the current crisis we're facing. Pandemic is one thing, and another is, do I double click? Another thing is my partner's surname is Symbiosis, and so some people foolish enough think Symbiosis must be a Japanese name because I'm Taiwanese, so I must marry to a Japanese person. But in actual fact, not. How do I do a full screen? Oh, okay. So Symbiosis is actually Ukrainian. So I'm married to a Ukrainian, Georgian, Russian family. And so this is who I am. So I am not just Taiwanese, I'm not just British, I'm Ukrainian too. And it's soul-destroying period to talk about this. I can hear my quacky voice. You know what I'm going to say. It's about peace, and that's all that is. It's about humanity and everything we treasure all this time. I'm going to start my presentation. So I guess you see, can somebody help me to do full screen, please?
We couldn't make it work full screen.
Oh, I see. Okay, so I'm just going to have to live with it. Okay, so you recognize this image, which is from the beginning of the film. And I wanted to talk about the landscape. I thought this is a kind of a panning shot to kind of introduce this sort of watery, the water world, basically. How do I go to the next? Oh, here we go. Oh, okay. So I guess Mike mentioned a little bit about why was me doing this project. And I guess my previous project is important and also quite relevant to talk about is that sort of the heritage inspired project, like Liz mentioned earlier about this one, you can see from 2018. I won't go into the detail, but this is a project which is inspired by the canal in Birmingham. And so it's working in collaboration with Icon Gallery and Grand Union Gallery. And with this 5 hours journey, So basically from the gallery, from the studio, from the Deep-Heads, we did this 5 hours journey, slowly getting to the center to Brittany Place. And on the way, so I invited a local archaeologist to help us to unfold that story of the kind of historic, where the historic and natural world meets. And then we have the Canal River Trust, an ecologist, who how to sort of looking at various wildlife on the way. And then we arrive, as we get closer to Brittany Place, and then we have Liz join us. So it's a kind of relay of information and also knowledge exchange, but it's also an opportunity for everybody to meet together, pretty much like what we're doing today. Then also we got this one from 2017 in Liverpool. So that's the first time when Mike and I worked together, and that's very much about the observatory and also the maritime history. So that's also the kind of the beginning. I begin to work with the scientists and also to really think about the use of technology, how science plays a very important role in technology, and of course the narrative of the British Empire. Then this one, Manchester Art Gallery commissioned back in 2015 and 16. So then I was also the resident artist in Science and Industry Museum, and that's where I first met Louise, who been extremely helpful to support the research and also to support the production of getting a group of volunteers who operate the linotype. But anyway, this story is really, really long. So all this information is on my website. And then the last two, these two are also done in Manchester at the Victorian Bath. Then this one, the Taipei Biennial, which is a kind of project to deal with the Anthropocene. So that is the kind of the backbone of, I guess, precisely why I was doing this project here. But throughout, I'm trying to get that. So throughout this exploration about dealing with the industrial history, and that is always been the back of my mind. I wanted to know what's the connection between the industries, well, the so-called industry, the heavy industry we know, and the connection with the natural resources. So where there's water, there's canal, there is coal, and the industry is expanded there, and also the settlement, the urbanization, and all that sort of connected into becoming the landscapes we know this day. And I was really curious about how those information kind of crease and cross together. I remember in the sort of the back of Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, I was taken to stand in that very point where we can see the River Irwell, and we can see the canal, and we can see the railway. And that's precisely how everything meets. And so for me, that location and also that kind of idea of a physical journey going through those places is so important. And here, Simon Pickles, who will be talking later on, who drove me around going through the landscape, and also Mick Oliver, you know, that journey of going through this kind of a walking the space, walking the landscape, is intrinsically important for my work. This is just give you a sort of background of what my connection with Doncaster. It started in 2019, way before pandemic. We call it peacetime, perhaps. That was the heat wave. So Mike and I didn't know where to go. We ended up being in a Unitarian church in the courtyard because there was a tree. There's a place for relaxing. I have a lot of problem and also critique I like to bring into the kind of the public art, which is here. That sort of unbreakable artwork, but perhaps have a lack of a connection with the humanity, or lack of connection with the environment. And this is something perhaps for us to think about. I'm not religious, but there I find some peace in the church courtyard. And then also later on, you obviously know the narrative of Gongdae, Buddhist center. You know, why do I get connected with this religious place? But in a sense, somehow, perhaps they do understand a lot more about people, and also to understand a lot more about connected with the environment. And I think that's a very important part of my process. There we were in the Hawcross, up on the water tower, and where we see this Hawcross Grammar School railway collection, those railway honor. That was like the beginning of the introduction. I remember Julia and Mike and I, we went up there. It was rather strange. But then we got also the high-speed railway and the railway museum in York. And then that's the museum, in the old museum's collection. And so that's kind of outlined my journey. But then I was taken to the back of the collection store in the museum. So I get to see all these fossils, fossilized woods. And then I started to feel like the narrative of mining industry, that's something really, I felt like it's so important. I want to know more. But then I am not part of the, I mean, I'm not part of this kind of, what you call it, a class system, or it's not part of my culture, and I didn't know how to deal with it. But for me, it was very important to talk about coal, this 300 years old piece of rock, this sedimentary rock. And you know, for me, it was very important to deal within those narratives. And I'm very grateful, Simon here, the little screen, that number 31, was taking me out on this trip and was reading J.P. Priestley's book, and to help me to use kind of literature to kind of unfold that narrative. Then obviously I was reading Down the Mine by George Orwell, and all these stories, and also we went down to see the actual mine in the mining museum. That experience was, for me, was very important to find a way to map up all this experience and how I navigate within all this narrative, and also how I connect with this whole place. And that's the famous film star here, Mick. He was taking me onto this journey. And for me, it was very important to actually go about to those places, and there you should really think about artists are very good at asking questions. So that I asked Mick, what are these tracks? And ask so many questions until like probably get really, like he's probably very bored of me asking all these questions. But it was important to be in those places and to actually go about to ask questions, to think about, you know, why these things are running in it this way, and why, what does it mean to bring the water back? Because the water was there at the first place. And I really was very much into when, for example, Mick was talking about when the water is back, you've got the condition, you've got the habitat, and all the plants will come back. And then the wildlife, the insects and animals will come back, as long as you've got the right condition. And for me, that was really important, that kind of idea of everything lives in the community. Everything is sort of a symbiotically, you know, there's a symbiosis. This is the drone view, looking at the moor from above. And for me, it was such a beautiful image of thinking about this is almost like a kind of a green corridor above the tree canopy. The idea of to be able to lift yourself up, looking from that different perspective from high above. And I think that's precisely what I'm trying to convey here. I know the story goes, you know, the connection with the peatlands and then to the colliery. But I think this is something we're perhaps not getting that narrative. The coal substance, coal and peat there's a kinship. They're connected. They're connected because, you know, one day after peat has been sort of developed for a long time, it's going to turn into coal, but we just need 300 million years. And, you know, that evolution is very important, and that idea of time, the geological time is here. And that's quite, I think I say quite a lot of what I ever want to say in the film already. But here, I felt like as I continue to meet people, as I continue to develop my work, that sense of my own identity, which is shifting, it's quite also amazing. And it's so nice to see Richard and also Bob. You know, my connection with Liverpool, my connection with Manchester, like the presence of these two individuals are so important, because it's the manifest itself of why we meet again, because there is the place and the people, and how I sort of develop my own roots. to ROUTES. So my roots to connect my kind of my network. So I know the narrative is always about people going to refer me as the kind of the other. So because you're not white and I'm from Taiwan, you know, those narratives often orientated by where I am from. But perhaps we should also focus a lot more about where I have been to, those places, this network of people, those expertise, which makes who I am now. And so I like that on the move approach as I continue to go. And so that idea of evolution, I think is present in my work. And the camera work is really low. It's really about closer to the ground. And I like that archaeologists are talking about this ground truthing, kind of closer, you know, coming from the kind of from the ground level. And I think that's what I find the most beautiful about Doncaster is that grassroots, the most amazing expert people that I've met. And that made me feel like I'm so drawn to this town. This image, I mean, after the opening, a lot of people telling me, nature is fighting back. Nature is back. Nature is taking over. I think it's not right. Nature has always been there, but it just nature is coming in a very different way now because of the kind of anthropocentric point of view and also anthropogenic input. And so nature is no longer the nature we perhaps know once, but as long as there's a human presence, you know, this symbiosis between human activity and the so-called nature will continue to have this sort of a co-evolution. This image was amazing. This is how I sort of see the colliery in that distance, you know, the slack heaps of this, the so-called redundant, the unwanted, but then this kind of, almost like kind of a hint of another layer of the kind of balance, if you like. And the last image, I guess you got that, then being the heaps and holes. This is my reading list. I thought I'd share with everyone. And I thought, whilst you look at my reading list, I think I'm going to talk about what's next. And so I'd like to say big thank you to Mike and Neil. So this film is going to travel to the rest of the borough in all the libraries. So the idea of disseminating what we have gathered here from the so-called center of Doncaster, but that idea of sending out this to various villages or these mining villages is of finding a way to send this back to the community, because this is what I've got from the community. And then the next thing is I want to take Doncaster's story out of Doncaster nationally and also internationally. And I think that is precisely the advantage of me being called an international artist, because, you know, I'm going to take your story out. And finally, I just want to spell out a little bit about a new project which I'm currently undertaking. I'm currently doing is working with metal in Peterborough. So it's all about exploring the fens, so the fenland, the peatland conservation, and also dealing with the history of the drainage, right? That's a crazy business going on there. I mean, we see this in the northern fen in South Yorkshire, this bit, you know, the water's being drained out, and it's being made for arable lands and agriculture. And what do we do next? And I felt very grateful. I have engineers supporting me. I went to see some pumping stations last week about how it works, and also went to help with eels conservation as well. So literally with me, you know, scooping the eels out and carrying them in the bucket from the sea water that side to the fresh water. So that's that kind of amazing thing about what I really love my job. And thank you.
Hello, yes, I'm Louise Hill. I work as an ecologist in Doncaster, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to introduce you to Lindholm Island and also to the group of people, volunteers who've been involved with guiding the landowner in the management of what is a relict area of mire in the middle of Hatfield Moors, which is to the east of Doncaster. My interests are botany and habitat management in particular, and I've been involved in the site since the early 1990s. Oops. Thought I'd just start off with an introduction to what mires are, for those who aren't familiar. Mires generally form in cool, humid parts of the lowlands of the UK, mostly in the northwest of the UK, but they can also occur in southern and eastern areas such as Somerset Levels, the Fenlands of Norfolk, and in South Yorkshire. The main constituent of a mire is the sphagnum peat, and that is the living organism which actually generates its own habitat, because peat does not rot down very well. It produces acidic and anaerobic environments, so over time the semi-decayed remains of the peat build up, and eventually the mire develops a convex cross-section. So the mire itself becomes independent of its surrounding landscape, reliant only on rainfall, and it's a very, very nutrient-poor environment, and the sphagnum outcompetes everything else, really. So it is actually a bit like beavers. It's like an engineer of the landscape in its own right, and it's just a moss. The interesting thing about Hatfield, this is actually thorn moors, but Hatfield is unusual in that in the middle of the moors there's a glacial moraine known as Lindholm Island, which was deposited by the glaciers less than 18,000 years ago. And at the time, in the Neolithic period, the landscape wouldn't have been a mire. It was a series of undulating sand dunes with birch and pine forests. And for some reason, the environment changed, the climate may have altered. And the area became occasionally inundated and then seasonally inundated, to the point where sphagnum mire started to develop over the top of the sand, and peat started to build up. Oops. Now this is an image of Hatfield and Lindholm Island, and you can see that there's been exploitation of peat from both Thorn and Hatfield for many years. There's a long history, and by the 1990s most of the moors was a brown desert with a desiccated, featureless landscape, and peat blowing behind the milling machines as they crossed this landscape. In 2004, English Nature bought out most of the mineral rights from the peat milling companies, and restoration began. But on the northern edge of the island, there was a part of the landscape which remained untouched, largely untouched, and this was because it was owned by Jack and Ethel Lyon, who lived in the hall, which is at the bottom of the photograph. They refused to allow peat cutting, and therefore this part of the moor has one of the deepest layers of peat remaining. The hall and the southern part of the island were purchased by Rangyung Yeshe UK, the Buddhist retreat, but they couldn't afford to buy the whole moor. And this area at the northern end, outlined in red, which was termed Jack's Piece after Jack Lyon, they couldn't afford to buy it, so actually a fundraising exercise was undertaken in the memory of Dr. Peter Skidmore, who used to work at Doncaster Museum, and he made a lifelong study of the invertebrates of the moors. And so it's fitting tribute that we contributed to that fund and helped to preserve this patch of ground as a conservation site in perpetuity. And later on, the other half of the site was also purchased, so the whole area was taken into one ownership. The area that we first bought was referred to as Lindholm Old Moor, so if I refer to that, it's this, generally this area of the site. A group of local naturalists and scientists, volunteers, have taken on the role of advising in the land management And we try to ensure that the site remains as a refugium for important plants and animals so that they can relocate themselves onto the wider moors, and so that they can provide that seed to help the moors recover. Particularly important are the relic populations of the wet mire invertebrate species. We manage water tables and monitor them where we can to try and establish and maintain a wet mire and heath. We also try to make an inventory of the organisms that live there and monitor their changing populations as the re-wetting process continues. Drain blocking and scrub clearance work actually started on this part of the moors back in 1992, when the then owner, the Lyons family, allowed a group of volunteers from the museum and Doncaster Naturalist Society to go on in the other weekends in winter months to carry out work, and we still do that today. The site is absolutely reliant on rainfall for its water. It gets no water from anywhere, no water comes in from anywhere else. And therefore it's important to study exactly how much it gets and how it reacts. So we've set up a weather station, which you can see the results of on a website. If you would like to see how sunny it is at Lindham at the moment, you can tap into your mobile phone. I thought I'd show this picture. This is one of my favourite pictures actually of the island. It shows vegetation height, and it uses a detailed topography mapping system called LiDAR. But it's not just ground level that this is showing. This actually shows vegetation height across the northern end of the island. And you can see the hotter colours are higher, taller vegetation, and the deeper blue purples are the low vegetation. And what this image tells us is that actually the wettest area, we think, where the vegetation is being stunted by waterlogged conditions, is located in that corner. And the odd thing is that is the highest ground. That is a hill. So the fact that we've got stunted vegetation, we are hoping means that the area is still wet after all these years and all the drainage that's gone on around. We encourage visiting scientists to carry out surveys. In 1997, Peter Skidmore found a rare beetle called the Maya pill beetle. That is a scale bar of 1 millimetre, so you can see it's not easy to find. That is an indicator of wet mire habitat, and we were very keen to see whether that was still there in 2013 when the group started, and we were lucky to find one individual. So we have preserved a wet peat habitat for all that time since 1997, and we hope we can continue to do so. We've also monitored the distribution of the sphagnums to see where they are and whether that indicates whether the area is wet. And again, they are clustered in that higher but wetter northeastern corner of the moors. We've studied the plants, and particularly the common cotton grass, which really does have a preference for wet conditions. And again, that is clustered in that northeastern corner. There have been studies of the nightjar, which live on there, and also the Doncaster Naturalist Society carry out moth trapping evenings. The island is home to ancient oak trees, which are very important for wood-boring beetles, and also hornets, which come to the moth trap at night, which can be quite an interesting experience. This again is a LiDAR image. This is detailed topography mapping of the whole moors. So if you're not familiar with Hatfield, it extends around, it's wrapped around by this deeper blue and black coloration, which is the lowest lying land, some of which is below sea level. And you can see the patterns. That's the low areas, the high areas with the island in the middle. That's Lindholm, which is white and orange. And you can see that Lindholm Old Moor and Jack's Piece, which is the top edge of the island, is orange. And what we're trying to do is, as Mick will explain shortly, is hold water on top of a hill, which is not an easy task. When the raised mire formed over sand, that must have meant that the area had a very high water table at the time of mire inception, otherwise it would never have been able to form. But over the years, the site's been drained for numerous purposes, including drainage for the peat milling itself, drainage for agriculture, and then we've got the problem of lowering of the water table in the aquifer below, in the sand, for the public water supply of an ever-increasingly large town and city, perhaps to be, of Doncaster. And the site only receives 565, on average, millimetres of rain a year, which means it's on the absolute cusp of viability for there to be a lowland raised mire in this location. And we're now maybe experiencing periods of greater drought and water deficit. So it's under stress. And in 2020, we did have a very serious wildfire which spread across the southern edge of the moor. Fortunately, it missed most of the island, Jack's Piece and the Oaks. But smouldering peat fires can burn for months unseen in deep peat, and they are all the while releasing carbon dioxide. The amount of carbon dioxide that was released from this fire was calculated to be the equivalent of the annual emissions of 30,000 people. Wildfires are not unique in heathland habitats. They do occur, but the damage they can do is exacerbated by the desiccation of the peat. And so our view is that the water level management on and around the moors really must target and ensure that the peat remains in a saturated condition, so as to prevent oxidation of the peat itself, reduce the risk of damaging wildfires in the future, and also re-establish carbon sequestering mire habitats. And I'd like to thank very much Paulette and David Benjamin of Rangyong Yeshe for helping us in our work and also supporting the group.
Right, I'm Mick Oliver, ex-Deputy Chief Surveyor for the South Yorkshire area in Doncaster. Started working for the Coal Board in 1955 and lost my job in the collapse of the industry in about 21. And so I found a job with Doncaster Council as a planner, as a town and country planner, and I became case officer for Thorne and Hatfield Moors, basically because no one else wanted it, so they dumped it on me, and I absolutely loved it because it was a very, very, very controversial site in those days. It still is. And so I nursed Thorne and Hatfield Moors through a very interesting and very eventful decade, culminating in the buyout by the government of peat working rights on both moors, in which I took quite a part in that process. So very quickly about Lindholm Old Moor. So in 1992, the very mild-mannered scientific gentleman, Dr. Peter Skidmore, very mild-mannered man, waved his clenched fists in the air and said, "We must do something to conserve the wet end of the species range," in a big meeting. And what a debate followed that outburst from Peter. And so 30 years ago, no one told me that to re-wet this old moor would be almost impossible, and I was daft enough to try. And so, with a lot of help from Doncaster naturalists, and then from the Buddhist community at Lindholm Hall, who have been very helpful, I decided I could re-wet it by plugging the drains. And so I started a project to plug the drains, and these red marks here are all plastic interlocking piles hammered into the ground, into the peat, across a network of almost invisible drains. Some of them are invisible. Some very expert people tell me that because these drains are full of detritus, they can't pass water. But I can tell you that they are simply plain wrong. These old drains lose a lot of water. So the water is lost mainly by surface drainage and then by evapotranspiration. And so what we've tried to do is retain water, as Louise had just said, on top of the hill. And if you'll forgive my frivolity for a bit, we now have a pile of water on top of the hill. And the water table here is many and varied. So this round here is stage 1 of the re-wetting scheme. And up at the top end here is what we call the old turberies, the turbary, the peat working areas. And they progressed along here and met the Marquesa of Hertford's land, which is here, basically. So Lindemole Moor is it's classed as a primary degraded bog, primary degraded mire. Degraded because of the drainage from peat working all the way around it. So for over a mile in every direction, there's been 2 to 2.5 meters of peat removed, and that's lowered the water table. That water table is recovered a little bit by the conservation works that's been done on it, but the water out here is about 2 meters lower than the water we are retaining over here. So, if I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So the water management scheme has been extended by putting another set of dams in here. Now, the land slopes gently from over here down here. It falls about 6 inches in that distance. But there's undulations in between. And here we have what we call a moraine, which is a fluvio-glacial intrusion. But we also have a very interesting feature here. And that is a wonderful periglacial landscape of sand dunes and sand hollows buried in peat. And where you can see the high spot here, the peat is only 1/2 meter deep in places here. And in between there are sand hollows. One at least is 3 meters deep. But that inhibits water coming back this way. The old dome, water dome, is here, which Louise has already referred to. And this is basically this pink area here of the raised area is from a LiDAR that was before the re-wetting scheme, basically, or at least the latter part of the re-wetting scheme. And so, I'll have the next slide, please. And so we've raised the water level quite a bit. Now this this image was produced for me by Tim Prosser, and it's a fantastic image, I think. Tim says it's a bit messy and doesn't show much. I disagree. I think it's a fantastic image, and it gives me an awful lot of information, and I'd like to talk you through it. So basically, that top right-hand corner, the northeastern corner that Louise has referred to, is over here, and goes. And this is what we call the Dipwell Transect. So each of these lines, these messy lines, is an annual profile. But it's not just any old annual profile. It's the average profile from every dipwell on this transect. So he starts off with a red line. And then he works through on a yearly basis of through shades of pink into brown, into yellow, and green, and then into blue. And all the lines all join together at the top here in one thick line, a bit messy, yeah. But what that shows is that we've raised the water level to the maximum feasible possible level here. Now over here, which is the outfall, the lowest drainage point from Lindholm Old Moor, we've raised the water level 1.4 metres. To my belly button is 1 metre, 1.2, 1.4 metres. That's how much we've raised the water level there. Further than that, here at the top of the old water dome, we've raised the water level by 60 centimetres, that much. But probably more importantly than that, during this process, we've spread the zone of elevated water. I don't like using the term water dome here. I think that should be reserved for a much larger area than what we've got here. So the zone of elevated water has spread in this area here, which is about 100 metres on this scale. And there we have raised the water level within the peat by 1.2 metres. That's that much. This is where we've extended. This is where we've extended the re-wetting scheme. It's been done for 2 years, and it's now beginning to recover the water levels. Now, it's very easy to see improvement in the flora, but the real ecology of the mire is in the invertebrate population. And whilst ignoring the mosses, we've probably got 2 or 3 dozen plants, species of plants on the old moor. We've got 3,000 to 5,000 species of invertebrates, some of them exceedingly rare. And the thing that Lindholm Old Moor has got going for it is it's got 3 advantages: location, location, and location. Slap bang in the middle of a severely damaged Hatfield moors. Lindholm Old Moor will never be pristine in the foreseeable future because it's on top of a hill and because of the surrounding peat workings. It's not the ambition of the Lindholm Old Moor management group and the landowners, not their ambition to make it pristine. The objective is to conserve remnant populations of some of them exceedingly rare species until such time as they might get the opportunity to successfully escape and recolonise the surrounding Hatfield moors, the very severely damaged Hatfield moors. And it's a very interesting place for you to visit sometime. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, as was said, I'm the director of the North and East Yorkshire Ecological Data Centre, and I'm a product of the West Riding. I'm a product of millstone grit and dark satanic mills and rugby league football, and many other things. But I'm also a nerd, and I think it's my nerdiness that's got me here. My job really is as a storyteller. And like all good stories, the stories I try and tell are based in the truth, and they're intended to influence people. They're intended to influence the people who make decisions about conservation, about land management, about sustainable development. And the media I use to tell those stories are statistics, graphs, and perhaps the most mystical and persuasive of all, maps. Maps are great. I'll just tell you a quick story, because I thought this image is a linking image for a lot of the themes that have already come before me. This is Saddleworth Moor. Last year I was walking late one night on Saddleworth Moor with my daughter and a friend, and we came up on Pewel Hill. That's the peak of Pewel Hill, and looking across the A62 to Thieves Gill, right across to Manchester, and all the areas we've talked about before, the whole moor was ablaze. And standing there, it was reminiscent really of a John Martin. I mean, there's a clear reflection there. And standing there, you could smell the peat. It was a taint from before the Industrial Revolution. You could have been in West Donegal that night. And standing there with the breeze coming towards me, you kept getting buffeted by the heat coming off the fire. It was like if you've ever flown into the Middle East and you open the door of the plane and suddenly, whoomp, the dry air hits you in the face. It was like that. And very memorable, there were blues and twos there. The friend I was with had to run off because he's worked for Kirklees Council. He was responsible for those moors, so he had to do a runner. And the following morning, the newspapers were full of stories, and they were very human stories. The journalists had been speaking to the family who'd been setting fireworks off to celebrate a family birthday, and were so horrified by what had happened that they were still waiting there when the police arrived. They'd spoken to the Mountain Rescue and to the fire brigade who'd fought the fire all night, and they'd spoken to farmers, and they'd spoken to the National Trust who'd been looking for the livestock on the moor all night. But me, very much like Louise, I headed off to the satellite imagery, because the questions that I wanted to know was, what habitats had we lost? What species were associated with that habitat? What had burnt first? What had survived? Which bits were wet? Which bits were dry? Those are the kind of questions that I was asking. Most importantly of all, can we stop it happening again? And how can we recover what's been lost? And in the morning, I started making maps and sending them to my friend in the hope that it would give him some kind of input to the first response to these fires. I've been reflecting. It came a bit of a shock to me over the last couple of years, because I thought I was living in a society that had abandoned evidence altogether, that people were now making their decisions based on beliefs regardless of evidence. And yet, COVID came along, and suddenly people started being interested in data. Every major press conference started with going through the graphs. And I knew it had come to something when I overheard my daughter and her friends chatting about the R value in the Wakefield district. And they're 10 years old. And I thought, there's hope for me as a record centre manager. Mr. Trump hasn't put the final nail in the coffin of evidence-based decision-making. There's some kind of hope. So, in this world of climate and biodiversity crises, issues that are so big, it's really difficult to make them tangible to people? How can people engage sufficiently with these issues that I care passionately about? How can they care about them enough to drive them to the data, to drive them to the stories that I like to tell? Because I've been doing this for 20 years, and I have to be honest with you, my stories have been spectacularly ineffectual in influencing decision making. Uniquely rubbish, I'd say. So, you know, it's time for another approach. My record centre is full of narrative elements. It's full of the threads of good stories. And it's about time to let somebody else start telling those stories alongside me. Telling them from a different perspective, telling them with different media, with different emphasis, with different life experience. So I think it's time to open up what I do to, or what I have, what I hold within my organisation, which is not just data from now, not just satellite imagery and LiDAR, though, like Louise, I love them. I'm a nerd. You know, we nerds love them. But we have records and books and handheld manuscripts going back to the 1700s. We have an important legacy of the observations of both expert gentlemen naturalists, but also the numerous working class naturalists that work tirelessly across the whole of my area. And I think it's a huge resource. As I say, I think it's a huge pool of narrative bits and pieces that need drawing together. So I think it's time to open up an art and ecology lab to bring us nerds together with you artists, in the hope that we'll get a bit of reflected cool from that, because that would be great. Because we nerds need all the cool we can get. And in the words of a popular TV series, the IT crowd that's very, very popular with nerds says, I can be your bridge. I can be your conduit, because ich bin ein Nerd. Thank you very much.
Someone's probably going to correct me on this, but I think it was actually European law that stopped the peat mining in 2000. Is that the right date?
It was, as far as this country was concerned, it was a buyout by the government, because it would have been very, very expensive for Doncaster. The value, I got a valuation of the moors. It had to be done by the mineral valuer. It couldn't be any valuer. It had to be the mineral valuer to do the valuation, yeah, which came out at I think around about £40 million to buy out the. And so that would have been a lot for the taxpayers of Doncaster to face. And so we persuaded the government, Michael Meacher, to buy out the peat working rights. And because you can't do anything instantly in law, it's not lawful to say you've got to stop now. You've got to give people time. And so they're given 2 years grace, which means 3 working seasons. And if you pay up front in valuation, in economics, you pay the present value of the right to receive £1 in 3 years' time, and that halves the value. So we actually got it for, I think it was £17 million, and that was done by the government.
Yeah. Okay. Is there a question off the floor, or any comments or observations?
No, it's like when things get industrialised, they get sort of real monetarised. So in order to get nature back, we have to buy it back from people who own it to then put it back to its original state. I mean, that seems to me to be a really interesting attitude.
We went through a very difficult period of negotiation, and we managed to get European designation for the moors, for special area of conservation and special protection area. The SCAC is just for the habitat. The SPA is for a species. And the species that is protected under that legislation is the nightjar. And we went through a very difficult situation, pulling a few stunts to achieve that. And I can tell you that those nightjars are very expensive birds.
Okay. David, do you want to say something?
Well, generally?
Yes.
Well, I can share some work that I've been doing. So my name is David Bramwell, and I grew up in Doncaster from the age of 6 to 18 and left in 1986 and always had that strong affinity with the place. My family is still here, and Doncaster always gets a kick in, and you know how it is. It's okay to make fun of your own family and criticise them, but when other people do it, it really hurts. And I always felt very protective of Doncaster when I'd hear Doncaster being kind of ridiculed in comedy shows, you know, endlessly. It was always the butt of the joke, whether it's Count Arthur Strong or Blackadder. And I always wanted to give back because some of my strongest memories and experiences were here. So I wasn't sure how to do that, and I thought what I'd really like to do, because my parents got me into walking, and I live by the sea. I live in Brighton now, and I love being by water. And it occurred to me that I'd grown up in a town that took its name from a river, in fact from a river goddess, and I had no relationship at all with that river. All I knew about the Don when I grew up was that it was polluted. It was declared biologically dead up until I think the 90s, and you kept away from it. We never walked by it. We never had any association with it, and I knew that things were changing. So I decided to come back and walk stretches of the Don, try and find the source, try and find the origin stories of Danu, who gave her name to Daneham, to Doncaster, and to reconnect with the folklore and the mythology of that river and the ecology, and tell a positive story about how the river has been cleaned up and how it's changed. And I met people like Ian Rotherham, who was then at Hallam University, and the folklorist David Clark and others, and had the opportunity to make a Radio 3 documentary about it for a series called Between the Years, which is an experimental approach. And the things that I wanted to talk about were, I was very happy with that program. Oh, no, I was half happy with that program. I felt compromised that some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about, they were sniffy about in terms of the folklore and maybe the more kind of mystical elements of it. And so I had to turn it into a solo show to get it out of my system. And I performed it at Castor 4 years ago, and I'm bringing it back in May, on May the 4th or the 5th, I can't remember the date. And that is a story of, as I said, of me going in search of Danu and rekindling a relationship with waterways and with nature in a meaningful way. And for many, many years, I wanted to try and figure out how to reconnect with water and do rituals around water. And the resolution eventually came in 2019 when I joined a Druidic order, and found that the Druids were a great way of satisfying that meaningful connection with nature, because there's nothing superstitious about it. It is about honouring nature and thinking about our symbiotic relationship with nature. And the work that I've been doing since then, because all of this happened in 2015 onwards, and I'm still occasionally performing the Cult of Water. The bugbear that I think I carry and I feel is very important is that our stories and our metaphors and our narratives around how we relate to ourselves and the natural world are really messed up, and they come from industrialization, and they come from an age in which we transitioned from Christian metaphors or religious metaphors in how we related to the world around us, which were hierarchical and monarchical, into mechanical industrial metaphors that were driven by science. And we still hold those metaphors, and we still hold metaphors and narratives of conflict. And there's no better proof than this than watching the latest David Attenborough series, The Green Planet. I'm not criticising Attenborough. I have a lot of respect for David Attenborough. But if you watch the first episode, and I couldn't get past the first episode, the music irritates me, and I love Attenborough, and I love the way it's filmed. But if you go back and watch that first episode, I cannot tell you how many times he talks about the battles, the conflict. He uses conflict metaphors throughout, and that's what we do. We use metaphors of conflict. there is no question of the symbiotic cooperative nature going on. It's trees fighting each other, it's plants fighting each other, and these metaphors of battle are in everything that we do and we say, in the way that we think in the West. So we think of ourselves as being selfish because we're told that our genes are selfish, because we're told that nature is selfish, and these are stories, not objective truths. And so I'm very interested in challenging those metaphors. Yeah. I won't say anymore.
This is Angela Robson, who's also a local broadcaster, filmmaker, and also a rewilding recipient.
Thanks so much. It's David, isn't it?
It is. Yeah.
David, I loved listening to what you've just said. I grew up in Conisborough by the Don, wasn't interested in it. It was a polluted river, went to school in Mexborough, and probably have similar memories of this very dark, foreboding landscape. And so I really connect with what you're saying. I'd love to hear more about the project you're going to be doing, the rewilding the system project. If we've got a few minutes, just if you can tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I don't know yet because it hasn't started. I'm interested in exploring further the ecological narratives around the River Don, and maybe creating some kind of audio trail that would be accessible to everyone, and bring in elements of Doncaster's history and the Don's history, and ways that we can find meaningful connections with the river and the natural landscape. But that's all I can tell you for now.
Hi, I'm Simon Ward. I'm involved in the Doncaster Grammar School Railway collection, and as you can probably gather from that, I went to Doncaster Grammar School and a native of the town. And picking up on the point Mike made about Thornmoor and Hatfield Moor being sort of private areas, when I grew up, that's exactly what it was, and it made the Isle of Axholme itself quite a sort of mystical place, mainly because you couldn't access it, and also because the landscape was so very different to anything else in the town. One of the things that has been done, sort of this idea of linking industry and environment, is there is actually a walk called the Peatlands Walk, or the Peatlands Way, I don't know if the exact title, which is a circular walk which takes you right through the middle of Thornmoor and Hatfield Moor. And I did that with a friend a couple of years ago. I don't think it's particularly well publicised, and it's not actually very well signposted on the ground. If you didn't know what you were doing, you could miss it. But I think if this is all about trying to get people to sort of understand the relationship between industry and what was here before, there is no better way of doing it, because you go through landscapes like Thornmoor and Hatfield Moor, which are obviously very heavily influenced by the history of what happened there. And also, you go through, I gather it's going to change, but the walk actually takes you through or round one of the pit tips at Hatfield Pit, which again is another way of, there's no better way of understanding the impact of industry on the landscape than walking over or around a pit tip. So, you know, I think there's a lot of scope there to try and get people more interested, local people more interested in that walk and in some of the issues it raises, which are really the subject of what we've been talking about today.
And how far is that walk?
Well, it's a circular walk. I think it's about 50 miles altogether.
And it goes through many villages and places?
Well, no, because it's a Peatlands Walk. Yes, it does. I mean, it goes sort of, some of it goes past Stainforth. Some of it also it covers industry, because it goes along some of the canal network that linked the River Don to the Humber and the Ouse and what have you. So a lot of it there's not a lot that actually goes deliberately through towns, and some of it as well also goes along the track bed of the old Axholme Joint Railway, which was the only railway, apart from sort of industrial railways, that ran through the Isle of Axholme, which is also another railway that people don't know much about, and is not really a very glamorous railway network for sort of railway historians. So it's a brilliant way of actually understanding the sort of relationship between the two.
If I can just echo what Simon's saying, I think it's absolutely right. During the lockdown, it's the middle of our project, and then obviously I couldn't come here. I couldn't continue to work with Simon. I couldn't continue to get to know more about the railway collection. But then I spent so much time on Google Map, trying to understand the terrain, trying to understand the landscape, and I tried to work out where is what. It's sort of trying to build up this sort of network within my head. and it really doesn't work, you know. And not until Simon took me out for this trip, or walking behind Mick, as you can see in the film. Very much of the shot is behind him, and that's sort of following his footsteps, kind of going through this journey, and then everything began to sort of make sense. I guess something, well, the railway or the technology have brought us is to travel from one place to the other, that movement. But then we forgot this sort of you know, because of that muscle memory, because I've gone through that physical walk, and then, you know, that physical connection with the land, with the water, with the river, with the terrain, and then everything is sort of become part of my own experience, and therefore everything sort of makes sense. Begin to be able to be, I begin to be able to make sense of everything, and I think that's fundamental. Another point I'd like to comment on earlier was talking about buy back, use the monetary term to buy back nature. Return to the original state. But the truth is, we're never, ever going to go back to the original state. And I think that's really, really important from what Mick was been telling me. Because like Thong and Hatfield Moor, we need just about 4,000 years to get it back to how it was. And I love that moment when Mick was telling me, oh, I'm 81, I haven't got 1,000 years to grow those peat back. But I do what I can while I can. That totally melts my heart. You know, I have so much admiration to this man here, and it was just mind-blowing. And it's that human story draw me into the landscape, and it's that human story, the connection I have with Mick, makes me feel like I want to know more about this landscape.
Yeah, I'd like to say two more things here now about walking on the moors. Absolutely brilliant, fantastic place. You know, people, any fool can enjoy a mountainous landscape, but it takes intellect to enjoy the flatlands. And people talk very eloquently about the size of the sky. Well, when it's quiet and the water is still, the horizon doesn't stop. Sorry, the sky doesn't stop at the horizon. It comes all the way down to your boots, and it's absolutely beautiful. But as far as walking on the moor is concerned, if you're going to take people onto the moor, you've got to look after them. They really want to go on with people who know where they are and what they're doing, because they are quite dangerous places. I'm a fully qualified bogman. And to be qualified, you've got to go in up to there. The good news is you float about there. And I've been up to there 3 times. And so they're a very dangerous place. And they're dangerous because my friend who was with me nearly died laughing. He had to throw branches to me to get out. And it took me about 15 minutes to get out.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I'm very privileged to be here. Actually, you know, I've come a distance, but the thing is, I don't think, you know, the title is full circle, isn't it? But there has actually been, perhaps to a lot of people, a quiet revolution, but it is a serious revolution. You know, in 1968, the phrase was "under the pavement, the beach," and it's, you know, like it's the kind of soils and substrates and things that people often don't give very much respect for, which are the starting points for these kind of adventures. Amongst other things, I chair this UK Urban Ecology Forum, and it's just a fact that 20% of the country's, you know, sites of special scientific interest are to do with industrial workings and quarries, and it's about the wonderful connection to all those wonderful places that has been often dismissed. And I think it's interesting to look at other countries. I mean, you know, we've mentioned the winding gear's gone. If anybody's heard of the Landschaftspark in Duisburg, just look it up. You know, like they've respected the whole landscape and let the trees grow through the pipes and the iron smelting, you know, like machinery. And you know, I think we can learn a great deal. Canvey Island is now being known as the brownfield rainforest. You know, in terms of the urban ecology stories that echo around this country are incredible. And it's always about nature and people. But that's the truth, the history of nature anyway is cultural, whether it be ancient meadows, it's the cultural connection with the landscape, as Ian Rotherham would talk about too, is so significant, and I think we underplay that. This is the UN Decade of Restoration, so these narratives are critical to the world. You know, it's the people connection always that, and sadly, the language that things like green infrastructure and kind of these steely terms, I don't think really work. So we've been talking about like heart and soul principles. We've actually been working with a guy called Jamie Reed in Liverpool, who's actually well connected to the Druid world, actually. So that's interesting.
The artist.
Yeah, yeah. So I think, you know, I just want to praise you because, you know, hearing the stories from all of you, I think you don't realise how big the picture is, and sometimes I think it's an incredible, you know, magnification.
I'm Paulette Benjamin. I'm one of the trustees at Gomde, UK, where Lindholm Hall Moor is situated. And, I mean, talking about there's a massive history that we've ignored, really. I mean, we can talk about 4,500-year-old trackways that are located in the Hatfield Moor. We can talk about how the moraine was created, which is phenomenal. Story of like history of like about Mick's got some amazing theories about where the trackway went. When he took me to he thinks I never listen to him actually, because he comes every week and I'm always too busy to listen to him, and he thinks I don't listen to him, but he took me to the trackway and he said he thought it quite an emotional thing actually, because he said he thought it went to Europe. You could walk to Europe, and the vastness of that is it was really touched me, you know, like that sort of sense of vastness. It's not like we want to get people to be tourists. We don't need people to like enjoy the countryside. You need to really connect with the depth of nature and the vastness of what it represents. And I think in the historical stories that comes out, there's also an ancient chapel was at Lindholm Island. Again, Mick's got some fantastic theories about that, which might be the site of the second Christian settlement in England. And I think all of this is so fascinating about this place and about how rivers were moved, how Hullingbridge Farm, on the way into the Hatfield Moor, there was actually a bridge there. Boats sailed from there. And we lose all this connectedness about our place. And I just think it needs, you know, our history needs to go much further than industry, because we've got a lot longer history than that.
But yeah, I had the find of a lifetime when I discovered a Neolithic trackway on the moors, and very close to Lindholm Moor. And it's 5,000 years old, plus or minus 50 years before present. Present is in 1957, which is something to do with nuclear bombs and stuff like that, because it's radiocarbon dating. One of the problems you get when you're a person like me is dealing with some very, very expert people. And if you imagine people like Stephen Hawkins, who got a lot of problems when he came up with his theories, because he is facing people who are already committed with the views that they've put down in print. And that's a big obstacle. And so there are many, many theories about this ancient trackway. And the generally held one is that it was a platform for religious rites to be performed on it. And I say to these experts, balderdash. It was a through route, a migration route through basically from the Langdale Pikes down the Vale of York, down to towards the Wash, and then walking over the North Sea when the North Sea was 60 metres shallower than what it is today. And it was a migration route from Europe up to a Stone Age factory on the Langdale Pikes. And there's a beautiful work of art, Langdale polished stone axe head that's never been used, not a scratch on it, which was probably dropped in transit on the southern point of Lindholm Island. And so what I think about it is not accepted by the scientific community, but I think that's their problem, not mine.
Liz?
It was just a response to those comments about the kind of the ancientness of the landscapes that we're still, as generations now, trying to re-plug back into. That we understand to an extent some of it. We know how far back some of the kind of recorded history goes, but it's obviously thousands of years of occupation, settlement, transit through the landscape. I was going to say, David, I want to praise your parents, actually, because this is the kind of fight I have with my kids who are 13 tomorrow and 11 about getting out into those landscapes and plugging into places that they're living, places that they're going to, that they have familiarity with, that they see, but that traditionally we're not from. We're immigrants, we're an immigrant family. We're not from the part of the country where we actually live. I was born in Manchester, but I was the first one. So it's that thing of what Yu-Chen had said about picking up that culture and kind of making that yours. Why shouldn't it be yours as well? Your parents obviously succeeded. I'm hoping I'll be successful, because at the moment when my kids say, what are we doing today? I go, we're going to go out into the nature and into the wild countryside and the built environment and the landscape. They go, is it a canal, a quarry, what is it? What is it going to be? Is it a railway track that isn't there anymore but used to be there? You go, we'll see, won't we? We'll find out and we'll explore and you know, you get this kickback. But actually, I was much more successful taking a group of Rochdale teenagers up on the moors above the town, and they'd never been there, and they'd grown up there, they'd lived all their lives. They'd never gone up onto the hills that surround their town. And we went up onto Cotton Famine Road, and it is still easy to get lost despite there being a beaten path. But what you become very much aware of when you're in that landscape is this is a messed with landscape. People have twisted it, they have done things with it, they've gone up there to be secretive, to be radical, to congregate, to get away from people, to move to another area. It's sort of, when someone's there to interpret that story for you, you can see it. You can actually go, oh, of course it makes sense. This is naturally the way to go. And if I go this way into the bog, then I'll literally be up to my waist the same way Mick was. That has happened to me and my family, unfortunately. So despite my thinking I know the moors, it still happened to me.
Hi, yes. I'm really excited by the discussion that's gone on about reconnecting, about understanding, about caring more. But from my line of work and from my perspective, it's all a little hollow if we can't project that forward and collectively and as a community make much better decisions. I think there has to be, in this whole idea of art and ecology, there has to be a sense of purpose. And that sense of purpose is to use what we learn to make better decisions, because we are at a point in our history where we could really use some better decisions being made. And I'd just like to throw just a little bit of light on that idea going forward in this process. That, for me, almost the most exciting part. We're in the Anthropocene, whether we like it or not. We're in the mess that we've created, and I think the most important, the most exciting thing that can come out of all this is a position by which we can collectively make better decisions.
I'm going to use that as a segue to ask a different kind of question, or asking someone else to ask it, which of course is what we're seeing in an artwork is not data, it's not information data. It's a blend of association, aesthetics, research, and it's a provocation. So coming back to you, when you say that we need a new sense of purpose, or we need something which is going to give us better decisions. How do people in the room, not just Simon, but you might have a response for me, how do people feel that art can do that, or what type of art should we be making as artists? So to bring it back to art, and because obviously there are lots of different ways of. This is Rob Gawthrop, who's based in Sheffield but used to be in Hull.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because I've been thinking all along of the issue of what you might say the intelligible, or of information on the one hand, and sensory experience on another, and of sensory experience as an aspect of knowledge as much as information. And I suppose it's to think of how one acts. Does one act upon experience or information, or a confluence of these? So those are quite questions that I'm sort of asking in a general way, because there's in fact in your talk of where you had certain public works which are literal, and I would say are not engaged with a sensory experience and do not prompt you to act, but they just have an obvious information that the outcome is predetermined, rather than giving the decisions to the viewer-listener. So that's just I could go on, but I'm going to stop.
Yeah, I want to say that because I wanted to. Well, I talked to you, didn't I, in the break? Simon, sorry, I can't remember everyone's name. And I really liked everyone's presentation, especially yours, Yu-Chen. And I think storytelling. It's storytelling. And I was talking to the guys who did the play. Because when you tell stories, human stories, and you take people out into... I mean, I used to teach photography at the college, and I used to take students out of the building into museums and different places. Rob used to take your students to the boathouse, didn't you, to a park?
Oh, I'd left by then.
Oh, you left. No, but
mythology.
Yeah, you had left, but no, but there was visits to this art in the park type thing. It was Paul Burwell, and there is a film coming out about him soon in Hull. And the area where the boathouse was, it's in the middle of Oak Road playing fields, which is 3 massive fields, and there used to be a farm there. And it's right by the river, and there's factories on the river as well. So you've got this sort of mixture of countryside type, a nice park with trees. And then you've got this factory over the road that's constantly going 24 hours a day. So there's this noise, this buzz. And then you've got rabbits jumping about, and you've got all these, and that is that sensory thing. You do need that, smells, all the senses we have, the smells, the touch, the hearing, the whatever, and also the elements, the wind blowing in your face, getting stuck in a bog, realising there is quicksand and sort of things that can trap you. I went youth hosteling and we got rescued by this woman who picked us up. I went with my sister. I was only about 17. And I thought we could walk 20 miles a day and do this, this and this. And it was like we got rescued. And she said, you need to do this. She was really helpful. And we ended up, being less adventurous. But yeah, storytelling basically.
Yeah, I think just responding to what Simon was saying, I think we're all sort of sat here and talking amongst ourselves, and we're kind of preaching to one another, and we're all already converted. And I think what was interesting about what Simon's saying is how do we move that upper level in terms of changing policy and changing and making things actually happen on a grander scale. And I think as artists, we're often seen in a little bit of a sort of anarchic way, or like we're trying to, I don't know, we're sort of at the level where we're being annoying in the background, or at a sort of low level, and I think trying to move what we're trying to do up levels, because we can wait until it comes from the top down, but changes aren't happening from the top down. And so I think, if I don't know whether I've interpreted correctly what you said, but more about how we move it forward, how we get to more people, how we make these changes happen, how we spread the word. And I think that's what art can do, is we are spreading the word, but how we I don't know, spread it at a higher level, or make those or influence those changes and make an impact at a higher level?
I'm drawn to this idea of an art and ecology lab because, to respond to Mike, I'm not sure I care too much about what art is created. What I'm really interested in doing is to work with artists, to look at the questions that they ask, look at the way that they research, and see what comes out of that. Ultimately, for me, perhaps the end product is, if a piece of art is less interesting to me. But I would like to engage with people who think differently, who ask different questions, who have different methodologies, who are iconoclastic, and who are quite happy to go against a scientific accepted norm. And I think it's that process, that lab process, that's drawn me in.
So my point would be, of course, that since the middle of the 20th century, the actual object or the material nature of the art object has become unimportant. So of course it's been about the process really since the invention of photography. We're now in that end point with a diffused digital age. But we do have a very beautiful aesthetic work which sits within a building, which is called an art gallery, and there's still a tradition and convention of looking at art in such institutions. But of course the process is everything. That's my comment. Has anyone else got a question? Otherwise I'm going to close it.
Can I just say something
from the floor?
About
Yu-Chen.
What art can do.
Yeah, thank you. On behalf of art, Yu-Chen, Wang.
I'm so embarrassed about that. But I think for me, it isn't about the final product of the work. It's about building relationship between places, between people, and that connectivity is intrinsic for me. And that it's a very slow process. So it took us 3 years to make this work. It isn't something that you can do a quick transaction, that kind of transactional exchange that you make the artwork. And it's also about, it isn't just about one artifact or artwork, it's about a whole series of inquiry, which brings me, the next thing what I ambitiously want to do is field research as art practice, and that's what I want to do.
Okay. Duncan, then Richard.
Sort of comment really about sort of where art can have impact, and I'm sort of thinking about, we're having a conversation that's very local here, and just that the idea of an art and ecology lab is, I think Doncaster's in a position where there's lots of really great stuff going on, and you can do something really unique, and if you can do something really unique and fund it and do it well and get people in there, I think that's where things happen for me. I think that's where you can do something. I think just the creation of an art and ecology lab should be something that people across the UK, across Europe are looking at. I think that's something really interesting to think about.
Thank you. Richard?
Okay. Quickly, the kind of science of ecological restoration really came from the American Dust Bowl. There's a guy called Aldo Leopold who was at Madison, Wisconsin, and it was that focus on the Dust Bowl and the disaster. But what he also talked about was a community land ethic, and I think we are talking about serious ethics. It almost goes back to the idea of common lands, and challenging heritage. So, for example, what has happened in cities? What has happened in public parks? Public parks have suddenly become a different place. Some of the original public parks, for example, some of the first ones are in Liverpool, they're all seen, like parks everywhere, seen as heritage parks. Now, this past year or more, we've been working in Prince's Park with Mandela 8, which is like a black group. They have never been part of a Friends group. And we've done wildflower projects in a Victorian heritage park where we couldn't have done that even 3 years ago. So it is this kind of rebooting things to now and not relying on Victorian visions. It is about the future, but it is having an ethic. And it was Andy Warhol who said, I believe, land is the best art, really is the best art. And he also said it's great to have a piece of land wonderful thing to do is have a piece of land and not ruin it.
So interesting, because the word art, even if we were to go back 200 years and ask somebody what is art and an artist, they wouldn't describe a kind of creative practice process of painting a picture or making a sculpture. They'd be talking about somebody who uses their ingenuity, their connections, the people they talk to, and their creative skills to make something out of the landscape. That's actually what people talk about in the 18th century. Oh, look at this triumph of art over nature. I mean, they are trying to say that nature isn't as good as what happens to it, but it's that understanding of what we mean by art. We sort of have this thing of we have art galleries, we have places to go and create art, experience art, but actually it used to mean doing something to a place.
Thank you. 1 minute from here, 1 minute from there.
We've been talking a lot about communities and connecting and how we can make a difference with art, and whether it's too localised or too insular. And I've been plugging into a lot of groups and thinkers that I just wanted to share that may or may not be of interest. So I'm part of a group called Alternative UK, and they do a weekly mail out sharing groups and artists and ways of connecting people with future thinking. The Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids is a great organisation to join. They do a lot of good work with ecology, and they're based all over the world. There's a writer called Jeremy Lent, whose books, The Patterning Instinct and The Web of Meaning, have been two of the most inspiring books I've ever read, and he's part of a movement called Ecological Civilization, which is growing and is really powerful and very transformative and inspiring. Rutger Bregman, who wrote Utopia for Realists, and the other one, Humankind, he coins this phrase, underdog socialism, where he says there's too many of us that have this attitude of, oh, what's the point, the world's going to shit, I can't be bothered, let's go to the pub and moan about it. And he really challenges that. The poet Selena Godden wrote a collection called Pessimism is for lightweights, and we need as many of these things as we can, I think, muster into our lives. And the more of those things you look for and you connect, you realise you're not alone, not alone and isolated with this work and these ideas. But there's a lot of movements out there that seem to be growing and supporting each other.
Just struck me when you mentioned that our understanding of art, that ecology comes from ecos. It's pertaining to the home. And some of this conversation has come back round to that this afternoon, I thought.
Full circle.
Full circle.
I have to say, that's the end.